If you were a commoner in 14th century England, setting off for a pilgrimage to Canterbury wasn't just a spiritual journey, it was an exhausting ordeal made up of sore feet, suspicious bread, and shared lice. Before taking a single step, you had to make one of the most important decisions of the entire journey: what to bring with you, and what to leave behind. Unlike modern travelers with suitcases and wheeled luggage, medieval pilgrims packed light, mainly because everything they carried had to be hauled on their own back or strapped to a donkey, if they could afford one. Their satchels included essentials like coarse bread, called maslin, a mix of rye and wheat, salted meat wrapped in cloth, a wooden cup, and a water skin, often made from sheep's bladder. One might also carry a knife, a pair of socks, and perhaps a comb, though its purpose was more for picking lice than personal grooming. Shoes were an issue from the first step. The average peasant wore turn shoes, thin leather stitched inside out and then flipped, offering little more protection than a thick sock. These didn't stand up well to rain or rocks, and roads were full of both. And that brings us to the roads. If you imagine a clearly defined dirt path leading through peaceful countryside, you're being far too generous. Most roads were barely more than muddy trails forged by repeated foot traffic, wandering carts, and the occasional noble's horse. Roman roads still existed in parts of England, impressive stone-paved highways built centuries earlier, but by the 1300s, most had fallen into decay, their stones scavenged for castle walls or buried under layers of time and mud. The King's Highway was the technical term for the major routes overseen by royal decree, but oversight didn't mean maintenance. The responsibility for repairing roads was pushed onto local landowners and, increasingly, onto communities through a practice known as statute labor. Every able-bodied man was expected to give a few days, a year maintaining roads, though few actually did. As a result, you'd find yourself walking miles through rutted, waterlogged stretches where cart wheels had carved trenches so deep they could drown a chicken. With no road signs, GPS, or even consistent maps, wayfinding was mostly about asking the right people at the right time, or following existing paths and praying they didn't lead you into someone's private lands. Getting lost was common. Even if you managed to stay on the right path, your chances of encountering a bad quarter, a stretch notorious for thieves or floods, were high. Travelers often joined together in small groups for protection. Pilgrims weren't alone, merchants, beggars, soldiers, and even pardones, religious hawkers selling fake indulgences, crowded the same trails. Each group had its own dynamic, but one common theme tied them all together: misery. Feet blistered, stomachs churned from suspect food, and sleep was rare and often disrupted. If you were lucky, you might find a wayside inn. But don't expect cozy comfort. Most inns offered a straw mattress in a shared room full of snoring strangers, rats, and questionable stains. You slept with your pouch tucked into your shirt and a hand on your dagger. Some pilgrims even preferred to sleep outside or in church porches, called porch sleeping, if they were near holy sites. The average medieval traveler was one boil away from a full-blown infection. Hygiene on the road was non-existent. Soap was rare and water often carried its own risks. You might find yourself sharing a stream with sheep, geese, and latrine runoff. Biting insects were a constant companion. Fleas, lice, and mites lived in your clothes and bedding, especially in inns where bed sharing was routine. Parasites were so common that some religious orders included them in their rules, advising monks on how to politely scratch themselves in public. As for food, the longer the journey, the worse the menu. Without preservatives or refrigeration, meals were a gamble. Travelers often subsisted on black bread, onions, cheese, and ale. Water was not trustworthy. Beer, even weak, was safer. Sickness wasn't just common, it was expected. Pilgrim's disease, or Canterbury sickness, was a broad term for dysentery, stomach cramps, and fevers that afflicted those on the road. It wasn't unusual for a journey to end not at the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, but in a roadside ditch. Medieval travel wasn't just slow and filthy, it was expensive. Pilgrims needed money for food, in stays, tolls at bridges and town gates, and bribes to bypass certain regions. Wealthy travelers hired guards or joined armed convoys. The poor relied on charity, or stole. Many towns charged entrance tolls to fund local defenses or road repairs. Some charged for crossing a bridge. In particularly mercenary regions, even the use of a public well or stable cost a coin. Those who couldn't pay were either turned away or fined in more creative ways, such as surrendering personal items or food. By the end of a single day, the average pilgrim's feet would be bruised, stomach empty, and hopes only half intact. Still, they pressed on, driven by faith, obligation, or sheer desperation. And yet, despite the discomfort and danger, the roads were busy. Why did so many people risk such discomfort just to reach a religious shrine? Was it belief, or something deeper? Let's imagine you've survived your first 2 or 3 days on the road to Canterbury. Your shoes are soaked and beginning to tear at the seams. Your food, mostly stale bread and overly salted beef, has become a chewable memory of better meals, and your water skin now tastes like a mix of leather and whatever suspicious pond you refilled it from. You're sunburned if it's summer, frostbitten if it's winter, and in both cases, blistered. And just as you start to think it can't get worse, the road brings you to its most feared feature, other people. Though the open countryside was full of hazards, wolves, swollen rivers, untrustworthy food, none instilled fear like highwaymen. These weren't noble Robin Hood figures. They were desperate, often former soldiers, unemployed after wars, who had turned to ambush and extortion. Bandits operated in small bands, lying in wait at key choke points like narrow paths through forests, sharp bends, or river crossings. A common tactic was to block the road with a cart and feign distress. Once a traveler stopped to help, the trap was sprung. Some even wore clerical robes to disguise their intent. It wasn't uncommon for a man of God to rob you blind, especially if he wasn't actually a man of God. The line between monk, mercenary, and mugger was thin in these parts. And what was worse, justice was distant. Local constables had little incentive to patrol outside their own villages, and many were corrupt or too afraid to act. If you were robbed, you rarely got anything back, except, perhaps, a scar or a broken rib as a souvenir. Travelers learned the hard way to avoid moving alone, especially at dusk. Groups of 10 or more could deter an ambush, but even that was no guarantee. As your journey dragged on, you would have encountered a less violent, but equally persistent obstacle, tolls. Medieval England was littered with toll gates, each overseen by some local authority, be it a bishop, baron, or borough. Bridges were especially profitable. Some noble families built them purely to charge travelers for using them. Tolls varied widely. Sometimes it was a penny to cross a bridge. Other times, you'd pay by the number of feet, your own, and your donkey's. Carts paid extra. If you carried goods, expect to be taxed per bundle. Worse yet, these fees could change without notice. Heavy rains. Toll goes up, for road repairs. A noble's wedding nearby. Double toll, to ensure safety. It was a racket, and travelers knew it. There were even pavage grants, royal permissions given to collect tolls in exchange for promising to repair roads. Rarely were the roads actually repaired. To avoid these costs, some pilgrims took side paths or greenways, but this increased the risk of getting lost, or ambushed. For the poor, tolls were a burden. For the clever, they were a negotiation. Many travelers offered services, mending tools, entertaining guards with lute music, or reciting prayers, in exchange for passage. Technically, all pilgrims were under the king's protection. In fact, royal decrees granted travelers the peace of the road, and robbing a pilgrim was a serious offense. But like many medieval laws, enforcement was spotty. Sheriffs and reeves, local law officers, were overburdened and underpaid. Their power stopped at village borders, and many simply didn't venture out into the wilds. Justice often came down to vengeance. If your town knew who robbed you, they might retaliate. Otherwise, your options were limited to praying the bandit got boils. On certain holy days or feast weeks, the king would issue temporary patrol orders for major roads, but these were symbolic more than practical. As for legal recourse, you'd need to travel back to the place where you were robbed, locate witnesses, and appeal to a local court, assuming you weren't already penniless or too sick to walk. Let's talk about the bathroom. Most travelers relieved themselves wherever they could, behind trees, in ditches, or next to stone walls. Some monasteries along pilgrim routes provided privies, but they were reserved for guests or monks. There were no public toilets. Chamber pots were luxury items for the urban wealthy. For the rest, squatting was standard. This reality meant that roads, and the surrounding shrubbery, were peppered with human waste, which in turn contributed to the spread of disease. Travelers knew to avoid downstream water and stay away from certain bad-smelling groves. The rare pilgrim who tried to maintain personal hygiene, by carrying cloths soaked in vinegar or washing hands with ashes, was often mocked. Cleanliness was considered suspicious, even heretical by some, as if it indicated vanity. Carrying coins was dangerous. So most travelers converted their savings into tokens or letters of credit, which could be exchanged at monasteries or with traveling bankers. But this system only worked in larger towns. On the open road, cash was still king. The savvy traveler disguised wealth. Nobles dressed as merchants. Merchants dressed as farmers. Real farmers just looked miserable. Inns were notorious for theft, not by strangers, but by staff. It wasn't unusual to wake up and find your boots missing. Some pilgrims tied their belongings to their legs while they slept. Others slept on top of their packs, or buried them in a ditch near the inn before bed. Identity theft was another risk. Without ID papers or passports, anyone could claim to be someone else. Impostors posed as lost sons, returning crusaders, or messengers of the king, all to gain favors, meals, or a place to sleep. Even speaking too well could mark you. A peasant who used educated words might be accused of sorcery. In some places, travelers were expected to carry letters of safe conduct, but most commoners couldn't afford them, or read them. Not all roadside encounters were hostile or grim. Some were just bizarre. You might meet a wandering hermit who refused to speak but offered salted mushrooms in exchange for prayer. You might pass a band of flagellants, half-naked men beating themselves with whips, calling down God's wrath on society. You might even witness a traveling play troupe performing mystery dramas in the middle of a field. And then there were the quacks, men selling magical relics, snake oils, or miracle dirt from the tombs of obscure saints. These were often con artists, but people still bought in. After all, if a copper ring blessed by a monk could protect you from boils, wasn't that worth a few pennies? Each roadside interaction was a risk, a puzzle, or a story. Pilgrims shared tales at night over fires, some true, some not. They built a culture of caution, advice, and camaraderie. Despite the chaos and discomfort, pilgrims marched on. Whether driven by piety, penance, or pure stubbornness, they endured the absurdities of the road. But as the miles wore on and the city of Canterbury loomed near, another set of challenges awaited, challenges within the city gates, among the relics, crowds, and spiritual scams. What happened when the journey ended, but the suffering continued? After days, or even weeks, of trudging through muck, dodging bandits, rationing dry bread, and praying for dry weather, you finally catch sight of it. Canterbury. Its spires rise above the surrounding fields, its stone walls etched with the dust of centuries. The thrill of arrival surges, less like a religious revelation and more like the exhaustion of a farmer finally sitting down after a long harvest. You've made it. But the worst, in some ways, is not yet over. As you pass through the city gates, you're met not with solemnity, but a kind of medieval festival. Vendors line the streets selling trinkets, roasted meats, vinegar pies, relics, ribbons, and wine that tastes suspiciously like wet wood. Pilgrims mingle with merchants, pickpockets, prostitutes, and pardonas, all drawn by the unending traffic of holy tourism. The smell is overwhelming, a mix of human sweat, spilled ale, incense, manure, and stale fish. Drums beat somewhere in the distance. A man dressed as a jester performs tricks for coins. Children run through the crowd with bells tied to their tunics. You push forward, hoping for peace at the cathedral, but instead find yourself swept into a slow-moving line of pilgrims, all with the same goal, to see the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. Canterbury Cathedral is vast, magnificent, and filled to capacity. The shrine of St. Thomas Becket, Archbishop, martyr, and political nuisance, is the center of it all. He was murdered inside this very cathedral in 1170, allegedly by knights acting on the indirect wishes of King Henry II. The event shocked Christendom and turned Canterbury into one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in all of Europe. You inch forward, barefoot now, as was customary when approaching a holy shrine, past dozens of flickering candles and wooden statues of saints. Latin chants echo off the stone walls. Above you, stained glass windows tell stories you can't read, but feel the weight of. Finally, there it is, the shrine. Covered in gold, studded with gemstones, and glimmering in the candlelight, it looks almost otherworldly. Monks usher pilgrims past it quickly, allowing only a brief moment to kneel, pray, and leave an offering. Some pilgrims press their foreheads to the tomb. Others whisper prayers. A few simply cry. You do whatever you came to do, confess, pray, whisper thanks, and then you're ushered out into the sunlight again, your moment over in seconds. Now that your spiritual duty is done, it's time to pay. Literally. Cathedral authorities charged for everything, viewing relics, purchasing tokens of the visit, called pilgrim badges, and even making offerings. Wealthier pilgrims could pay to have a priest sing a private mass on their behalf. The poor were expected to donate whatever they could. It was considered both holy, and an obligation. Relic sellers near the cathedral hawked splinters of the true cross, shavings of Becket's bones, though he'd been dead for centuries, and vials of water supposedly collected from the floor where his blood once spilled. Most of it was fake. But people believed. After all, the very act of believing might bring healing. Ill pilgrims touched their sores to the shrine. Mothers brought cloths to bless for their children. Those who couldn't afford real relics dipped their badges in holy water and hoped for the best. If you planned poorly, you'd now have to scramble for a place to sleep. Pilgrim hostels, called xenodochia, lined the edges of town. Some were run by monastic orders and were free or cheap. Others were for profit. All were crowded, loud, and, as usual, infested with fleas. Rooms were shared with strangers. Privacy didn't exist. You slept with your boots tied to your belt and your coin purse under your head. If you were ill, a monk might give you herbs, but more often you'd be directed to the city's leprosarium, which was part hospital, part quarantine. And if you had made the journey hoping for spiritual clarity, emotional closure, or physical healing, the truth began to settle in: the journey didn't fix anything. Your feet still hurt. Your belly still growled. And your sins, somehow, still followed you. Many pilgrims reported a kind of spiritual disappointment after visiting Canterbury. The shrine was impressive, yes. The prayers were said. But the reality never quite matched the expectation. For weeks, you imagined arriving and feeling a divine change, a new self. Instead, you felt tired. Some blamed themselves. Maybe they hadn't prayed hard enough. Maybe they hadn't sacrificed enough. Others blamed the church. The merchants, the crowds, the money, it all felt too worldly. And yet, people kept coming. Year after year. The pilgrim badge, often a pewter token stamped with an image of Becket, was proudly worn on the journey home. It signified survival, devotion, and social status. It proved that you had done something hard. That you had walked through bandit-filled woods, slept on straw, bled through your shoes, and still made it to the holy city. For many, that was enough. Of course, there was one final problem. You had to go back. The return journey, often overlooked in stories and songs, was just as grueling. In fact, some pilgrims chose to settle in Canterbury, rather than make the trip home again. Those who did return often traveled lighter. Some had shed burdens, guilt, grief, loneliness. Others had simply shed coin and patience. The road back had its own rhythm. You recognized inns, avoided familiar hazards, and perhaps even helped others who looked as clueless as you once had. And when you finally reached your village, tattered, sunburned, and covered in stories, you weren't the same. The landscape of your mind had shifted, even if the world around you hadn't. You had traveled. You had survived. And for better or worse, you had seen what lay at the end of the road. So, was the pilgrimage worth it? Did the shrine really offer salvation? Or was the real blessing found somewhere between the potholes, the parasites, and the people you met on the way? You are a merchant's assistant in the year 1293, somewhere in the eastern edge of the Holy Roman Empire, near what today might be the border of Austria and Hungary. Your master has made the decision to join a horse-drawn trade caravan bound for Bruges, a booming market town in what is now Belgium. The journey will take you through more than 1,000 miles of forest, mountain passes, toll-collecting villages, and unpredictable terrain. It will take weeks. Possibly months. But first comes the part that breaks your back before you even leave. Packing the wagons. A medieval trade caravan was a carefully balanced gamble. Each item packed represented both profit and risk. Most caravans consisted of 2 to 10 wagons, pulled by oxen or horses depending on terrain and speed. Oxen were slower, but cheaper and sturdier. Horses could move faster, but were fragile and costly to maintain. Your caravan is modest, 4 wagons, each reinforced with iron bands and heavy wooden wheels. The goods? Mostly textiles, undyed wool from the Balkans, dyed cloth from Italian weavers, and bolts of Flemish linen. You're also carrying barrels of dried fruit, sacks of rock salt, strings of smoked eels, wax, iron nails, and 3 small crates of glass beads meant for sale in northern towns. Most valuable of all, a chest of Venetian spices, cinnamon, cloves, and a little saffron. These are locked up and guarded at night. But it's not just goods you carry. You also have tools, spare wheels, nails, leather harnesses, and tar for waterproofing. Weapons, pikes, swords, and crossbows, just in case. Tents and blankets, because inns are rare, and roads are rough. Ledgers, bound in leather, full of numbers, weights, prices, and debts. The core of the caravan is made up of 6 men. Your master, a grizzled merchant with a sharp memory for numbers and grudges. 2 teamsters, who handle the animals and wagons. A guard, paid in coin and leftover goods, who claims he once served in Sicily, though you suspect he's lying. You, the assistant, tasked with keeping inventory, boiling oats, and not losing the keys. And finally, a young friar, hired as a scribe and spiritual buffer, someone who might convince a bandit to think twice, or at least write a compelling deathbed confession. You travel together, eat together, and sleep in the same circle of wagons at night. Privacy is a concept that doesn't exist. Along the way, you might pick up travelers, other merchants, and even pilgrims. But each extra person means more mouths to feed, and more chances of disagreement. Arguments are common. Everyone's tired. Everyone's worried. And no one can agree on when to stop, where to rest, or who's to blame when a wheel breaks in the mud. Your caravan's route has been planned, a generous word for stringing together a series of guesses and rumors. There are no printed maps available to merchants of your class. Only crude sketches passed from hand to hand, oral directions memorized from tavern owners, and the memories of teamsters who've been there before, though they rarely agree on anything. The goal is to stick to major trade routes when possible. These include parts of the old Roman roads, some still paved with worn stone. But many sections have crumbled into disrepair, swallowed by forests, rivers, or marshes. Detours are frequent. Flooded bridges, hostile towns, or toll gates might send you miles off course. Sometimes you travel alongside wagon trains of other merchants, hoping strength in numbers will discourage thieves or aggressive lords. Every evening you huddle by a fire and argue over the next day's route. Every morning you pack up in silence, hoping you guessed right. The weather is not your friend. Spring means mud. Heavy rains turn flat ground into swamps, and hillsides into sliding death traps. You stop every few hours to pull wagons out of the muck with ropes and sheer force. Horses stumble. Wheels crack. Summer means dust and heat. Sweat soaks your tunic. Grain rots in its sack. Salt cakes your skin. Every breath tastes like powdered road. Fall is slightly better, cooler air, firmer ground, but the shortening days reduce your travel hours. By October, snow begins to fall in the higher passes. If you don't reach Bruges before the first freeze, your entire caravan might be stranded in some lonely village with empty barns and no market. Each night you stop early enough to repair gear, relashing wheels, drying leather harnesses, and checking that nothing was stolen while you weren't looking. There are no hotels. You avoid towns when you can, because most charge entry fees and impose strict curfews. Instead, you camp in clearings or alongside rivers, forming a defensive circle with the wagons. Sometimes you sleep in barns, if you can find a friendly farmer. Other times, you sleep half awake, one hand on your dagger, staring at the silhouette of the trees. Wolves are less of a danger than thieves, but both come at night. You don't undress. You rarely take off your boots. You don't wash unless you find a clean stream, and even then you keep your sword nearby. Sleep is shallow. Dreams are full of snapped axles and missing horses. Keeping a caravan moving costs more than coin. Horses must be fed and watered, or they'll collapse. Grain and hay are packed when possible, but the caravan often buys feed from roadside vendors, usually overpriced and often moldy. Shoes wear out, on animals and humans alike. Horse hooves must be checked daily. If one throws a shoe, and you don't notice in time, you may lose an animal. And losing a horse means losing a wagon, or lightening its load until it can be pulled by fewer animals. Wagons break. Saddles snap. Ropes fray. And every piece of gear has to be repaired using what little tools you carry. No part of the journey is effortless. Every mile is earned. By the time you've traveled just 100 miles, your shoulders ache, your shirt is stiff with sweat, and your master is already grumbling about expenses. And yet, the real challenges, negotiating local tolls, passing through guarded valleys, and facing the real bandit strongholds, still lie ahead. So the question remains, how do you move through a fractured continent where every lord thinks he owns the road, and every village sees you as a target? By now, your bones are stiff, your hands are calloused, and your horse has developed a personality you dislike. You've traveled through dense pine forests, wide river valleys, and hills so steep you had to unload the wagons and carry the goods by hand. You're tired. But you haven't even reached the halfway point. Now comes the most delicate and dangerous part of your caravan journey, getting through the rest of medieval Europe without going bankrupt, arrested, or dead. In theory, you're traveling across the Holy Roman Empire. In practice, you're crossing dozens of miniature kingdoms, each with its own rules, tolls, borders, languages, and laws. Every valley has a lord, every town a mayor, and every bridge a collector. And each of them sees your caravan not as a visiting guest, but as revenue on wheels. Approaching a new domain is always tense. You must send someone ahead, usually the friar or your least grumpy teamster, to ask for safe passage. This might involve showing a letter of trade, if you have one, paying a toll at the gate, offering a bribe, or pledging to keep peace while passing through. Even then, there's no guarantee. Some lords charge by the wheel, some by the cart, and some by the type of goods. Salt. Taxed. Wool. Heavily taxed. Saffron. Double taxed, if it's even allowed. Occasionally, you find yourself in a fiefdom where outsiders are banned entirely. In that case, your only option is to detour, sometimes for days, around the domain. Tolls are more than a nuisance, they're a finely tuned system of extortion. There are bridge tolls, river crossing tolls, hill tolls, yes, for using hills, and even market tolls, charged just for carrying goods that might be sold nearby. Some examples. A stallage fee if you stop to rest your horses near a market. A passage fee for walking on a paved road. A pavage toll to fund road repairs that never happen. A pontage toll for bridges that are falling apart anyway. Many toll collectors are former soldiers or minor nobles. Their job is to extract as much from you as they can without driving you to violence. But sometimes, they push their luck. Refusing to pay often ends with your caravan being detained, your goods inspected, stolen, or your best horse confiscated for the good of the realm. So you pay. Beyond taxes, the greatest threat on the road comes from armed men with vague titles. You might encounter a band of mercenaries who call themselves the King's Peace. A knight and his squires who insist they are inspecting for contraband. Local militias, protecting the bishop's road. Or just straight-up bandits in breastplates. Sometimes they wear insignias. Sometimes they carry flags. But they all have weapons and are very interested in what you're carrying. A typical encounter begins with demands: present your papers, declare your cargo, name your destination. Then comes the negotiation. They may ask for a temporary inspection tax, or insist that they escort you through their territory, for a fee, of course. If your caravan is well armed or traveling with other groups, these encounters usually end in grumbling and delayed travel. If you're small and weak, you may lose a cart, a horse, or worse. Merchants in the 13th and 14th centuries began using letters of credit and trade permits more frequently, especially if traveling internationally. These were meant to guarantee safety and ease tolls. But many local lords didn't recognize foreign documents, or pretended not to. Forgery was common. So were language barriers. A letter written in Latin might mean nothing to a toll guard, who only speaks Germanic dialects. To deal with this, some merchants carried multiple versions of their permits, or hired translators. Others hired scribes who wrote beautifully but fabricated everything. In fact, the most valuable member of your caravan might not be the guard or teamster, but the friar, who can both read and forge seals well enough to get you through the next town without a fight. You don't travel at night. Not unless you're fleeing something, and even then, you probably won't make it far. The roads are pitch black once the sun goes down. There are no lanterns lining the paths. Torches are dangerous and drain your fuel supplies. And your horses won't walk well without light. At night, the world becomes silent, except for wolves, frogs, owls, and the occasional cough of another caravan camped nearby. You sleep in your boots, as usual. One man stays awake to keep watch. Fires are kept low to avoid attention. Horses are tied close. And you pray no one follows your wool tracks to your hiding spot. By this point in the trip, the oats are stale, the cheese is hard, and the dried meat smells like it might have feelings. You eat whatever you can trade for, barley cakes, old fish, or once, horrifyingly, fermented porridge shared by a monk with no teeth. Foodborne illness is constant. One of your teamsters hasn't spoken in 2 days. He vomited twice behind a wagon and now lies curled up under a tarp. You consider leaving him behind, but decide to strap him to the wagon instead. Everyone suffers from constipation, boils, or worse, travel dysentery, the curse of any long journey where water and food are suspect. Medicines. You have a small pouch of dried herbs, some vinegar, and one cracked jar of honey. You've already used the clean bandages. By now, every day feels the same. You rise. You pack. You roll. You unpack. You eat something terrible. You argue. You sleep on stones. There are no milestones, no scenic rest stops, no signs of progress. Every village looks like the last. Every toll booth smells like cabbage. The friar has stopped praying aloud. Your master keeps muttering about cutting the route short or selling to a Flemish middleman. The teamsters just want to get paid. The guard is drinking more. And still you press on. Because turning back would mean losing everything. Yet ahead lies more of the same. Tougher borders. Bigger towns. Crowded fairs. Flooded bridges. And the looming question, when you finally arrive in Bruges, will your goods still be worth anything? Or will prices have shifted, merchants undercut you, and all this suffering amount to a lesson in futility? You've made it. You see the high spires of Bruges in the distance, soaring above the misty lowlands like a promise wrapped in brick and smoke. You've survived the forests, the floods, the tolls, the rotten cheese, and the bored nights with axes. But the worst isn't behind you. The hardest part of this journey, of any medieval trade journey, isn't just arriving. It's getting in. Bruges is a booming city in this period, especially the 13th to 15th centuries. It's home to the Hanseatic League merchants, Flemish cloth traders, French wine dealers, and Mediterranean bankers. To a poor caravaner like you, it is a tangle of smells, languages, and prices. Everything is for sale. Everything is negotiable. Everything is under someone else's control. As you approach the city gate, your caravan is stopped again. This time by city guards, uniformed, well-fed, and absolutely done with your nonsense. You show your letters, your seals, your goods. They inspect your wagons, poke at your crates of wool, taste your saffron, and smell your dried fish. You pay your entrance fee. And finally, they wave you through the massive iron doors, under the stone gatehouse, and into the boiling chaos of Bruges. Trade in Bruges is regulated to a degree that feels nearly magical compared to the lawless woods you came through. But it's no less brutal. You must now secure a stall in one of the approved trading squares, or, if you're unlucky, on a muddy corner just outside the proper market walls. But not everyone gets a spot. The city is packed with caravans. Some have priority rights, granted by previous arrangements or bribes. Others are guild members, or are sponsored by powerful foreign trade houses. You're a middle-tier merchant from the Alps. You have a half-decent cargo and a seal that might be recognized. You wait in line at the market clerk's office, where a tired scribe, under candlelight, reads your trade permits and then makes you wait some more. Hours pass. You and your teamsters camp near the edge of the marketplace, fighting off dogs and hopeful pickpockets. Your friar sleeps sitting up. You dream of oat cakes. Eventually, you're told there's space in Copper Square, just behind the wool stalls. It's muddy. It smells like rotting onions. But you're in. Now begins the frantic unpacking. There are rules to follow. You can't sell directly unless you pay a broker. You can't open crates before sunrise. You must pay a stall tax each day. You can't sell food unless it's inspected. You can't speak against the local guild prices, ever. Every item you sell passes through someone else's hands first, a local cloth broker, a spice agent, or a guild master. They take their cut. Always. You haggle in multiple dialects, some of which sound more like gargling than talking. You pay a kid a copper coin to shout your offers in the local tongue. By sunset, you've sold 3 barrels of wool, some dried fruit, and a questionable piece of amber jewelry. It's enough to cover tomorrow's stall fee. Just barely. You don't get to sleep in a regular inn. Bruges, like most large cities in the medieval world, keeps foreign merchants segregated. You're assigned a bed in a stone barracks with other caravanners, some from the Baltics, others from northern France. No one speaks, no one bathes. The floor is straw. The roof leaks. Someone snores like a blacksmith. Still, it's safer than camping by your wagons, which are now guarded by a local boy you paid in bread and threats. You clutch your remaining money pouch like a holy relic. The next morning brings crushing news. A larger caravan from Flanders has just arrived, carrying 3 times the amount of wool, at a cheaper price. The guild adjusts the rate. Your margins collapse. You do the math in your head. You've lost money to tolls, paid bribes, eaten your own profits in food and lodging. And now you'll be undercut on every remaining sale. Your master is furious. The friar suggests prayer. One teamster quits. Another tries to sell the horse. You manage to offload the rest of your goods for a small gain, just enough to make the return journey barely worthwhile. The return trip, no glory, just survival. There is no celebration. You repack your wagons. You gather your tired men. You buy salt, cloth, and dried fruit, whatever you can afford to trade back down the Alps. The road south is still flooded. The tolls still hungry. The bandits still bold. But this is the life of a medieval caravaner, suffering in motion, gambling on weather, markets, and mercy. When you finally return to your mountain town, months later, you are thinner, poorer, and a little more cynical. But you are alive. And you already know. In a few months, you'll be going back. It always starts with a vow. Sometimes made in a moment of desperation. Sometimes made to mark the end of a long illness, the death of a child, or a miraculous recovery from a fever that should have killed you. In your case, the vow was made during a particularly nasty plague season. You had knelt in the muddy church of your village, skin pale, hands trembling, and promised that if you were spared, you'd walk to Rome and pray at the tombs of the apostles. Well, you lived. And now you have to go. In the Middle Ages, pilgrimages weren't just religious road trips. They were a dangerous, complicated, and often lifelong undertaking. People walked hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles to reach sacred shrines, relics, and holy sites. Rome was a big one. So was Santiago de Compostela. Jerusalem, if you could manage it. But even local shrines to obscure saints could draw long streams of muddy-footed travelers. Why? Penance. Pilgrimage was considered an act of devotion that could reduce time in purgatory. That mattered when eternity was the only time you thought about. Gratitude. If a saint healed you, or spared your town from fire, you repaid them with your feet. Escape. For some, it was a way out. A fresh start. A reason to leave the fields behind. Of course, some went for less noble reasons, curiosity, criminal sentencing, or to avoid marriage. And some, like you, were just trying to keep a promise. You are not a wealthy man. You're a cooper's apprentice, barely trained, barely paid. So your pack is light. Here's what you bring. One rough woolen tunic. A pair of cracked boots. A coarse cloak, too short, already patched. A water gourd. Dried peas and hard bread. A wooden staff. A letter from your local priest, confirming your vow. That's it. No map. No tent. No money pouch fat with coins. You're not alone. Most medieval pilgrims were poor. Many traveled on foot. And most of them, like you, began their journey by walking straight out of their village gate and into the unknown. You aimed to follow the Via Francigena, a rough network of paths stretching from Canterbury to Rome. Pilgrims have walked it for centuries. You have no official guidebook. But you know to look for. Painted scallop shells, a pilgrim symbol. Way shrines or small crosses on trees. The vague direction of south. You follow beaten tracks, ask for directions in local dialects, and hope that someone, somewhere, will point you toward Rome with enough clarity that you don't accidentally end up in Marseille. The road is rarely straight. And never paved. As a pilgrim, you wear no armor. You carry no sword. You have the haggard look of someone walking for penance, which is exactly why people are suspicious of you. At the first town you pass through, a baker gives you a heel of old bread. A tavern keeper shouts at you to go around back. A group of children follows you for miles, calling you foot ghost. Some people fear pilgrims, they associate them with disease, or see them as beggars. Others revere them, and may offer shelter or coin. But most people just want you gone. Especially in farming villages, where strangers are unwelcome and food is already scarce. You spend most nights sleeping in churchyards, near wells, or huddled under trees. You don't remember when it started raining. Maybe 2 days ago. Or 3. It doesn't matter, your cloak is soaked. Your tunic smells like sheep and despair. Your bread has turned into a sponge. Worse, the dirt road becomes a torrent of mud, swallowing your boots and nearly pulling your staff from your hands. You fall. More than once. At one point, you lose your balance crossing a stream and spend the next 2 hours drying your cloak over a fire, fed with damp twigs and quiet curses. Still, you press on. You passed a shrine to Saint Wilfrid this morning. You left a stone on the altar. It felt meaningful, even as your stomach growled loud enough to scare a bird. Medieval people believed that suffering was spiritually valuable. Your blisters. Holy. Your hunger. Sanctifying. Your thirst. Purifying. But theory fades when your feet are bleeding. You wrap them in linen. It helps, a little. Until the linen runs out. You meet another pilgrim on the road, a grizzled man from Burgundy. He shows you how to sew horsehair into your belt, so that every step is a reminder of your promise. You do it. It hurts. But it gives you something to focus on besides the ache in your calves and the rumble of your stomach. You eat wild herbs. You chew bitter roots. One night, you try to catch a frog. It escapes. You consider that maybe, just maybe, this was not the wisest decision of your life. After nearly 2 weeks, you arrive at a Benedictine monastery. It's heaven. Well, sort of. You're fed barley stew and old cheese. You sleep on a real cot. A monk bandages your feet, and another offers a small vial of rose oil for your sores. But before you leave, the abbot insists on a sermon about humility, sacrifice, and the importance of not dying on the road. You nod. Gratefully. Half asleep. Then, you walk on. Because Rome isn't going to come to you. You've crossed about 200 miles. Your feet are torn. Your belly is empty again. You've made new friends and lost them just as quickly. You've cried. More than once. And you're not even halfway to Rome. By now, you've given up on comfort. Your feet are one giant blister. Your boots are coming apart at the seams. And you've developed a truly remarkable smell, something between wet wool and swamp donkey. And still, you walk. But the road is changing. You've entered more rugged country now, low hills, scattered woodlands, and narrow paths that twist like snakes. You pass fewer shrines. Fewer people. And fewer signs that this was ever meant to be a pilgrim's trail. This is where things start to get dangerous. It happens on a Wednesday. You've just passed a ruined watchtower, and you're halfway down a wooded path when 3 men step out from the trees. They're not pilgrims. One has a rusty sword. One carries a club. The third just smiles like a wolf. They don't speak much. They don't have to. They take your pouch, which had 3 dried figs in it. They take your walking stick. One of them demands your boots, but the others laugh, they're falling apart anyway. They leave you with a punch to the ribs and a sarcastic, "God be with you." You lie on the ground for a long while. Thinking about whether this still counts as penance, or if it's just dumb luck. You reach a crossroads marked by a pile of rocks and a crooked wooden sign. At the base of the rocks, someone has carved a small cross. Fresh flowers sit beside it. A pilgrim's badge is pinned into the dirt. You don't know who they were. But you know why they died. Sickness. Starvation. Wolves. Infection. A fall. Exposure. The road to Rome is littered with graves like this, some marked, many not. And still, pilgrims walk. You walk. Because to go home now would be worse than dying here. You're limping through a thunderstorm, your left ankle swollen, your cloak ripped on brambles, when you spot an old woman under a tree. She calls you, "Figlio mio, my son," and presses a small cloth bundle into your hands. Inside is a piece of dried fish, some onion, and a lump of white cheese. She says nothing else. Just disappears into the woods. You eat the meal like it's the Eucharist. Later, you ask a shepherd about the woman. He says there's no one living out there. Hasn't been for years. You don't question it too hard. Miracles come in strange packaging. By some fortune, or maybe mercy, you arrive at a hospitium, a place run by a local church for passing pilgrims. You register your name, or what's left of it. You wash your hands. They feed you soup. It's not free, but it's cheap. A few copper coins, or a night of work in the kitchen. You take the kitchen. You peel turnips with two nuns, one of whom keeps muttering that all young men are thieves. The other gives you a second bowl of soup when no one's looking. You sleep on straw with 6 others in a stone room lit by oil lamps. You dream of warm bread. And you wonder what Rome will taste like when you finally get there. You've been walking for over a month. You've lost count of the number of days. You've eaten mushrooms you're pretty sure weren't poisonous. You've been rained on 12 times. You've seen 3 broken carts, 1 brawl, and a man trying to ride a goat like a horse. But the worst night? That's when you slept in an abandoned barn and woke up with a snake under your tunic. You screamed. It fled. You cried. And then you laughed. A lot. Because nothing surprises you anymore. Not the insects. Not the rats. Not the 3 monks who passed you arguing loudly about whether St. Paul ever had a beard. The road changes you. It makes you raw. It makes you real. One evening, you arrive at a hilltop chapel just as the sun is setting. The air smells like rosemary. A stream babbles nearby. The sky is turning soft orange, and bells ring from a distant village. A young girl offers you a crust of bread. A friar invites you to sing the evening psalms. You do. And for 1 hour, just one, you feel something like joy. Not comfort. Not pleasure, but stillness. And hope. And a deep, slow-burning belief that maybe, just maybe, this road is leading somewhere. Even if your feet disagree. You don't know exactly when it happens. Maybe somewhere in the Apennine Mountains, or at the last riverside crossing. But the pain dulls. The complaints fade. And you no longer think about how far you have to go. You just walk. And then, one morning, you crest a hill, and Rome is there. Not in a dream. Not in a prayer. But in stone. It takes another 2 days to reach the city gates. Your legs move automatically now, like they've forgotten how to stop. Every building looks impossibly large. The air smells different, like smoke and incense and sun-warmed marble. You pass traders speaking in 3 different languages, monks arguing about Latin declensions, and a child riding a chicken cart. And then you see it. The dome. The Basilica of St. Peter. Not the one you know from paintings. This is the older one, the one still under construction, lopsided in places, covered in scaffolding, but no less holy for its imperfections. You stop walking. Because you're not sure what to do now. You follow the other pilgrims. You line up outside the basilica. You wash your face in the fountain. You light a candle. Then, barefoot, you walk to the tomb of St. Peter himself, just as thousands before you have done. You kneel. You pray. And you cry. You don't cry for joy, or sadness, or pain. You cry because your body doesn't know how else to express the release. You made it. You are here. You, who nearly gave up 6 times. You, who lost your last crust of bread in a river. You, who spent a night under a bridge with 2 Flemish shoemakers and a goat that bit everyone. You are here. And it's overwhelming. You go to the pilgrim office near the basilica. There, a sleepy priest records your name in a thick leather-bound book. He gives you a lead badge shaped like crossed keys, proof that you reached Rome. Some pilgrims sew it to their cloak. Others hide it inside their shirt. One young man you meet insists on getting a tattoo, which is mostly just 3 misshapen dots in a triangle. You trade stories with other travelers. A woman from Normandy tells you she walked 600 miles with a mule that died halfway through. A monk from Bohemia claims he swam across 3 rivers and once outran a bear. No one believes him. A 12-year-old girl from Florence says she didn't cry once. Her father says otherwise. And for a moment, you feel like you're part of something ancient. A living thread, woven through centuries of dust and faith and absurdity. At the edge of the basilica, you find a small side chapel. Inside, a candle flickers next to a wooden plaque. For the pilgrims who never arrived. You sit for a while. And you think about the man who gave you his water flask and turned back. The woman you heard died from fever 3 towns before Rome. The small grave beside the hilltop chapel, unmarked except for a single wildflower. You light a candle. And you whisper a thank you. Because you know it could have been you. The strange thing about reaching your destination is that nobody tells you what happens next. You've dreamed about Rome for so long that it feels wrong to leave. You stay for a week. Then 2. You help clean a church floor. You eat your first hot meal in a tavern where nobody asks where you came from. You see a painting of Saint Sebastian that makes you cry again, for no reason you can explain. Eventually, you turn north. And start walking. Not because you're in a hurry. But because something in you wants to see what it feels like to return as someone new. You might not be on a dirt road outside Siena. You might not have eaten cold lentils from a broken bowl in a nunnery outside Assisi. You might not have learned how to sleep sitting up in a goat cart with your arms around a sack of onions. But you know the road. We all do. Long, slow. Full of regrets, and aches, and small miracles we only recognize later. So if you're lying there now, in the quiet, let your feet rest. Let your journey slow. And maybe, light a candle, just in your mind, for those still walking, toward Rome, or home, or just to a quieter place in their hearts.